Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm so delighted now to be having a conversation with Dr. Karen Poutasi. So many of you will know her. She's got such a reputation. Thank you very much for giving your time to us, Karen. And you've had an extraordinary career. You've had so many leadership positions in the health sector, medical and superintendent at Middlemore Hospital, and then I think chief executive at the Wellington Area Health Board in those days, and obviously Director General of Health for 10 years, and more recently 14 years as the Chief Executive of the NZQA, and now the Commissioner at Waikato DHB. But you've done many other things, as many women do. You've been on NGO boards, ministerial advisory groups, and much more. So we're delighted to have a chance to have this conversation with you. So, did you plan your career? Did it just happen? Any turning points?
Kia ora tātou, and thank you for the opportunity. It's actually quite hard to talk about your career, but I'll see what I can do in a way that may be helpful. Planning is a yes and no answer, because I do think it's important that we have a go at planning our career. Did I think I would finish up as Director General of Health or even in the public service? No, because I wanted to do medicine and I thought that would be my career path. And in fact, I've straddled health and education, and I would not have anticipated that. So I think one of the key messages that I would articulate, and that I've found through my own career, has been that when opportunity knocks, you sort of have to open the door. It's never the right time, I can assure you. You know, a brilliant opportunity will come to you and you'll say, well, that would be great if it was 2 years in advance. But I just encourage people to think, if not opportunity does come, then see if you can reach out and take that opportunity, because I've had the benefit of being able to do that. People have looked out for me and suggested this and that opportunity. And I've generally been able to be in a position where I could take that, and it's led places that I've found very rewarding. So do plan, and for my generation, I'd throw a little thing in here that it seemed to me that perhaps the guys of my generation planned more than the women, sometimes perhaps for obvious reasons, but look, for women, do plan. And for guys, continue doing what you're doing, because that's good. It then gives you some guidance as to where you want to invest time and effort, and you can prepare for things, but also be open to the opportunity of things that would take you in places that you would never have foreseen, because therein lies some great opportunities.
Thank you. Can you tell us some of the highs of this career?
That too is a really interesting question. For me, some of the highs are not in the big successes, and I'll perhaps talk about some big failures too. Yes. They're more in the day-to-day little wins. So building a great team, seeing that team deliver, seeing people that you've worked with who have been part of your teams promoted to other roles in the public service or indeed elsewhere, and seeing them be successful in their own careers. Those are the things that I find really rewarding, and they're not the things that you'd perhaps necessarily think about, but for me they're the things that are very important in a career. If we think about some tangible big highs, then establishing district health boards was a huge challenge. We did that inside a year. We built on the foundations of what we had, and we used the talent skill that was there. And that was very rewarding, because we also did the legislation in the same year. We wrote the strategy in the same year, and yep, it was great. Another one that perhaps is less obvious, but really quite challenging, is when you're in a position, as you often are in the public service, of being a regulator and a deliverer. That can be very, very challenging. So the one I struck as Director General of Health was the rollout of the meningococcal vaccine. It's many years ago now, really. And the challenge there was to be the person who decided that this was a safe vaccine, because that was the regulator role, and then effectively rolling that out across the country. And those are onerous tasks, but they're tasks that it's worth mentioning because they happen in the public service every day. People have to take regulatory decisions that have profound impacts. They have to take operational decisions that impact all our lives. And we're just coming out of COVID-19 lockdown. And maybe we'll come back to that later. But that's an example of major, major decisions that the public service, the government is of course responsible for those decisions, but the public service is sitting in there behind that, proffering advice and then operationalizing some very, very complex things. So there is something rewarding in getting those right. Equally, I've made some very poor decisions in my career. I'm happy to perhaps share one of those because I
do. Yes, that's we learn from our mistakes. Thank you.
We certainly do, and that would be another, I guess, key message. In fact, I think we learn more from, or I have more from my mistakes than through the huge successes. And so quite early on in my career, I managed to fill, Wellingtonians will know, the old overseas terminal, which is a big cavernous building that was sometimes used for meetings, but a very, very large building is what I would say. I managed to fill that with angry staff and angry union people as a result of decisions I was making as Chief Executive of the Wellington Area Health Board, and that was about closing Porirua Hospital. It wasn't that the decision was wrong, it was about 10 years ahead of its time for a start, but the thing that I got wrong was the consultation, the process. I hadn't got the process right. I hadn't brought people with me. And the benefit of hindsight, very, very obvious. But if you're a vaguely driven person, and I am, and I think that's an important aspect of getting things done, you absolutely have to make sure that either you surround yourself with people who are process people, or better, that you're aware of the need to include due process in your decision making. Otherwise, in fact, it takes you longer. It's fraught. You upset people, rightly upset people if they've not been consulted. So, the filling the overseas terminal with angry participants was the only way you could actually hold the board meeting, because people were so cross with the process that they needed to be heard. And so, in a public arena, you hold a board meeting in the overseas terminal to accommodate everybody who's really, really annoyed with you. I don't think many people have managed to make so many people annoyed at the same time, but I did, and it was a very big learning experience. So, as I say, I do think we all make mistakes. That's not to excuse myself, but really important that we learn from them. And I do think you learn more because it's quite painful. You learn more from your mistakes than you do from those things that go well.
Yes, thank you. That's a brave example. Public servants need to relate really well with ministers. It's a very important part about the chief executive role. I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you thought about that and how you went about that. You will have served many ministers.
Yes, I'm in the fortunate position of having worked with many really, really excellent ministers, and and everyone I've worked with has been excellent. Regardless of that, though, I think one of the critical things for a chief executive come Director General is that there needs to be mutual respect. So the political process is different to the bureaucratic process. There are different roles. As a chief executive, you have to bridge, of course. It's your job to bridge, to help your staff who are responsible for the public service side of the equation, and to deliver for a minister who's responsible for the political side of the equation. So you have to have some insight into what a minister needs, just as you would hope to be able to have a minister who has some insight into the public service side of the equation. So my approach has always been to seek mutual respect, and I've always found that, which is really good, because then you can work no matter what the what the crisis of the day is, or what the strategic approach is, you can actually work across that if you have trust. And you will have to work to gain trust, particularly if it's a new government that's coming in. There isn't an automatic trust that sits there. So you have to put time and effort into building the relationship and developing trust. Once that's there, you can do a lot. The other thing I would say, and it's probably self-evident, and every chief executive will smile at this, but you have to put really good people into ministers' offices. So most of those watching would know that the public service has places in ministers' offices for liaison between the office and the public service. This is not political advisors, this is the public service side of the equation. You need really, really good people in those offices. You need senior people, and you need to support them, because they, like you, and perhaps even more than the chief executive, are the interface. And it's always hard being an interface person. So good people, and ensure that you've got an effective interface. And with that relationship, you can go a long way.
Yes, thank you. Let's just turn to something a little bit different. This is more the leadership challenge. In the health sector, you're leading across an enormous system. You are leading within the ministry, but across an enormous system. Can you tell us any of the tips that you have about how to lead effectively over a large system like that?
I think the critical thing is, if you've got a large system, and we've got several of them, of course, there's health, there's education, there's social development, there's the economic agencies, is to realise that it is less, and you've couched it really well, it's less managing and more leadership. So it's more steering and less rowing. So your own department, you're rowing. You're working with your people to deliver. Across a big system, it's a leadership role, which again comes back to this trust element that I've been mentioning, because one of the big things, if there's a big system, I've found, is to assume senior people, assume everybody is, but if you're generally working with senior people, assume competence until incompetence is presented to you, and then you have to do something about it. But if you assume competence, then you build a trust and you build a supporting relationship where people work mutually together. If you come from a position of distrust, that fuels distrust, and you get negativity between different organisations. So from my mind, the trick is to build on a positive relationship where at all possible, and it won't always work. If it doesn't work, then you deal with it. But the trick is to, as I say, assume competence, and you'll actually go a long way. And that point about steering, not rowing, you can't take over the roles of everybody in the sector, because it just won't work. And the idea is to steer the direction and build on that mutual respect and support people to do their job well. And again, with that in mind, you can generally get a long way in a complex system. And I suppose the only other thing on that is, the systems are complex, but try not to make them more complex than they are.
Yes.
So, one of the big ways to actually help people working in systems is to get barriers out of their way. And systems are built to work to the average because they have to. And you soon realise that, particularly in providing services such as education and health, not everybody's average. And so either within the system and its delivery side, or actually in the actual service delivery, you have to appreciate that things may have to be done differently for different needs. And I think sometimes we forget that, because we're so used to working in big complex systems, these are the rules and this is what we're doing, that we forget that actually the rules are for the average. And if you're in a minority position or a minority population, the rules may well not fit your frame. And so as managers in this large complex system, don't make it more complex than we have to, and realise that we actually need to adjust the system so that it genuinely delivers for everybody, not for 4 out of 5 students, but 5 out of 5 students, for argument's sake, and same in health. And that means that we have to adjust things to be able to accommodate different perspectives, different circumstances, and different worldviews.
Yes, very important. Thank you. I'll ask you about the trends in a moment, what you've noticed in the past and what you think's coming up. But just, you seem to have really enjoyed working in the public service. I'm sort of interested to know if that's true, and also what are the qualities that you've seen in yourself and that you've seen in others that makes it work well?
I certainly have, and enjoyed working in the public service, and I'm delighted that, you know, as commissioner, I've got a role there within the health system. I would encourage anybody considering a career to think about the public service, and as I sort of said earlier, or wider state sector, that wasn't a career choice, you know, that I'd ever contemplated. It came about because of certain circumstances, and once working in this system again, I found it extremely rewarding, because I think it's a bit trite, but one of the key things that we ask ourselves is, you know, why do we want to do things? Why do we feel this is rewarding? Why is it that we're doing something? You know, sort of, you ask the why, and then you work out the what and the how. And so the why, I think, is the ability to make a difference, to contribute to New Zealand Inc. in whatever way, shape or form that might be. And in the public service, wider state sectors, in a very privileged position to be able to contribute. And yes, it's challenging, and yes, it's fraught, and yes, you've got to be smart, and you need nous, and you need courage, and you need, you know, but it's a really, really good place to work because you're making a difference. And I think a lot of us want to make a contribution. And for me, if I was making a contribution in that way, then I found it a really, really good place to work. Lots of collegial support. You should expect that, and you should get it. I often say to people who know from the private sector, you know, there's no one chief executive that I couldn't ring in a day, and regardless of how busy they are, they would get back to you. So the collegial network, sometimes it'll be 8 or 9 o'clock at night, the phone would go, I'm sorry I missed your call, I'm just unpicking the calls, or I'm just unpicking the emails. What was it that you needed? And of course I would do likewise. And just knowing that that's the way the system works, I think, is a really important symbol of the collegiality that is there, and that you ought to be able to expect. Frustrations galore, of course. That's nothing's simple. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't find it challenging and interesting. But really good collegial support.
That's really a lovely picture, that people may not be aware of that sort of amount of support that takes place. Yeah. Okay, we won't say how long the career is, but can you say to me, in the time, what are the big changes that you've noticed, the dramatic changes over this time? Some will have come quickly, some will have developed over time.
Again, a great question, and yes, because I go back a little way, I can probably go back to the all care but no responsibility phase, before we went into the contractualism in the 1980s. So that was a move into what and I think a lot of other people do call it this as well, very good vertical accountability. So we became totally accountable for our own organisation's delivery. And that was good because, you know, prior to that, we'd been less definitive about what expectations were. There was less regularised
Yep.
reporting, and budgets were probably there, but not necessarily felt to be really important. So that brought in an important phase for the public service of accountability, and I think a lot of people, myself included, would say that was good, because we needed to be accountable. The downside, of course, and we know this, but it's worth rehearsing it, was immediately you go for the vertical accountability, you lose your horizontal responsibility. So I'm responsible for my budget, my team will deliver, and whether or not that helps you over here with your budget, your responsibility, is a moot point, because that's not what we were responsible for. And so, again, as part of my career, I've seen that shift now into not away from being accountable for your performance. That's still important, but a bigger emphasis on horizontal responsibility, so that the whole system delivers, and that being as important as your vertical. And of course, you can model that up into teams. We want teams to be delivering on what they're responsible for, but we want them to own the totality. So it's not surprising, but we are in a better place for having stepped through that process. And it's been very interesting watching the process, and we're still fine-tuning it. It changes to the legislation to enhance and enable this horizontal responsibility is the way I like to put it, horizontal responsibility, while still being accountable for your piece of the puzzle. And I think that is something that the country benefits from, and I think ultimately it is essential. So that shift has been, to my mind, really interesting, and important for the public service per se. And we're not the only public service in the world to have gone through those shifts. But because we're a small country, we often say we ought to be able to make this work. And it is good that we have got to a place where we recognise both. And I suppose in saying that, the other thing that I've not necessarily noticed, but does become quite apparent when you think about this is not an either or, and this is part of the complexity that is the work that we do. So the concept around polarities of, it's not accountability or responsibility, it's both. And I love the example of, well, would I tell you to breathe in, or would I tell you to breathe out? And you tell me, well, that's stupid. I have to do both. I'm not going to succeed if one or t'other. But a lot of the work that we do is actually in that space. And so people, I think as public servants, we need to say, if we're pushed on a dilemma of this or that, it sometimes is both. And we shouldn't be afraid to say that. We shouldn't be driven into a corner of saying, we need this or we need that. It's actually frequently that we need both. And so it's not a but, it's an and. And I think this is much more part of our lexicon, and it's just exemplified by that shift in how we organise ourselves.
I was going to ask about the future, and that will be something for the future, but I wondered if anything else, whether technology or the role of Māori or diverse communities, whether you've noticed big changes in some of those areas?
Yes, I have, and I'm glad you've raised that, because I think one of the keys to a successful public service is having a diverse public service. Because if we don't, then we are very, very likely to get so narrow in our focus that we don't take account of different points of view. And if we do that, we're going to go the way of the dinosaurs. I mean, it is so obvious that you need a diverse cadre and a diverse set of opinions and different lenses sitting round the table, different points of view. And that is what we achieve if we appreciate the role that Māori have to our being in Aotearoa. And we've sometimes paid lip service to that. And I really love the quote from, I think it's Verna Myers, who says, "Diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being invited to dance. So I do believe, and I think we're seeing ourselves as a public service moving more to appreciating that the invitation has to be to dance, rather than merely being invited to the party, which in fact you don't have to be invited to at all because you're there as of right. So that in itself is an inappropriate casting of roles. So moving towards more genuine partnership and inclusion, and valuing that for what it brings us, is something that I have seen movement in from way back when to now. We still have a way to go. I think we would all say that. We are not nearly where we would want to be in genuine sharing of perspectives and genuine co-decision making in order to get better decisions through. We still default to what I call our ethnocentric perspective of, we've grown up in this frame, it's the comfortable frame that we're in, we don't necessarily want to step out of it, and besides, the system supports the majority. So, but as I was rehearsing before, in fact, that won't work. The system doesn't work for everybody, and if we don't appreciate it doesn't work for everybody, then we're not doing our jobs properly. So to my mind, that's a really important shift that's occurred over time. It's a shift that still has a way to go, and I think we all need to have that in front of us at all times.
So it's one of the biggest challenges for the next 10, 20 years. It's a big challenge for the future. Any other challenge for the future that you'd be telling today's public servants to how they're going to have to transform? Anything else you'd pick on?
Well, I would pick on the digital. A large number of people know that at the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, we've been working on a future state program which says, we live in a global digital connected world. Well, COVID's shown that, hasn't it? But it also has shown the need for digital connectivity. And it's also shown, because into that I also bring equity of opportunity. If you don't have equity of opportunity, you cannot fulfill your potential. And so the need to ensure that everybody has access to a digital device, that they are able to be connected to the Wi-Fi, and that they are able to engage in a digital world is tremendously important. I mean, I go back to the days when you could leave school and go down to the local garage and stick your head under the bonnet of the car and off you go, mechanic in making. Well, now we've got at least 3 computers sitting under the bonnet of the car, and anybody who would dare to touch that without would be very, very foolish. So the point is, from our education perspective, all our students need to be able to function as they come through the compulsory system and then go into vocational training and other forms of tertiary education. Everybody needs to be able to function in a digital world. Otherwise, again, we don't have equity of opportunity. And so that's, to my mind, another shift. I can still recall, as a little throwaway line, going to the World Health Assembly for the first time. I wasn't actually Director General, but as the lead person for New Zealand. And our corporate services manager and ministry came to me and said, "This is exciting, Karen. We have a fax machine, and you will be able to communicate overnight, for decisions." And I was sitting there blankly saying, "Well, I've got my passport. I'm ready to go. But what the heck is a fax machine? What's a fax?"
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, that's the movement that we've sort of, but now the reverse would happen on what's a fax, don't use those anymore.
Yeah.
But
that
has been the shift, and it's a good thing, because it's all about connection and connectivity and different ways of working, and that opens up different opportunities as well. But we've just got to make sure that those are driven by a commitment to equity of opportunity.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I'm coming to the last question, and obviously I cannot I must ask this question as a Director General of Health and a public health specialist, just looking at the last, well, not just the last 6 weeks, but even before then. Just give me a bit of your assessment. What's health done well? What's it not done so well in your view?
Well, you're definitely asking the wrong person in that regard, because I think health has done spectacularly well. But then I think the public service as a whole has done spectacularly well. And Team New Zealand has done spectacularly well. Yes. Because it's taken everybody to make it work. But I do think that the test of a public service or an organisation is in, you know, when something massive comes along, how does everybody respond? And to my mind, this has been a really complex situation. Nobody's had a very firm line of sight from the beginning. We're getting greater clarity now. And it's all very good to be wise with hindsight. You will find a lot of people do this. But what the public service had to manage with was complexity, lack of information, and yet major decisions to be made. And no comfortable decision, because there's trade-offs all the way through. So you focus on health, and you come through to a position that we're in now, which is looking really good, far better than I thought it would at this time. And you know, and that needed to happen. And then you've got to trade off the economy and what that means for people as well. As for the economy, it's not a blank economy. And there are, it's just a classic. There are trade-off decisions all the way through. And I think a public service that rises to that is able to provide the best impartial advice coming from different sectors with different perspectives, because this comes back to that diversity of perspective. Really, really important, which means the government's in a position to make difficult decisions. So it's my congratulations to health and to the public service and to everybody who's pitched in to make this work, because the public has had to have a lot of trust in what's been the pathway mapped forward, and the fact that we're in a good position, as tragic as that has been for some people, and will go on being really, really difficult for a lot of people. New Zealand, the results speak for themselves. New Zealand's in a very good position to build forward. So it's not saying you can't possibly say it's been a success, because people have lost their lives, people have been ill, people have lost their livelihoods. But in the context of what's happened internationally, New Zealand can say some good decisions were made, and we're in probably the best possible position we could have hoped for in order to build forward. And that's a real tribute to everybody who's had anything to do with this.
So nice to end on a note celebrating the public service as a whole, but more than that, actually celebrating New Zealanders and their culture and the people that they are. So I'm delighted to finish there. Thank you so much. I'd much prefer to be able to be speaking for much longer and face-to-face, because you have so much wisdom and warmth to share. So Karen Poutasi, thank you so much. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.